Hello, my name's Catherine Harries and I work at AHDB as a disease scientist for cereals and oilseeds, and I'm responsible for the recommended list disease ratings. Today I'm going to talk to you about some changes that are happening to the yellow and brown rust ratings this year. So just hopefully you can all see my slides now. So we're going to talk about why the changes to the rust ratings are needed, what the changes are. So we have the weighted ratings and the reset slope, and then talk about some information we've got coming out in the new year on how to target varietal monitoring for yellow rust. So the weighted rating applies to both yellow and brown rust, but all the other changes are just for yellow rust. So we'll focus on yellow rust in this presentation. The first thing to note is that varietal resistance to yellow rust tends to be based on single major genes, and this generally causes the resistance to be less durable and makes it more likely that varieties will break down to new races of yellow rust. And this is in contrast to diseases that are based more on multi and small gene resistances, where many genes all give a small contribution to the resistance in a variety. This multi-gene sort of resistance is much less likely to break down to new races of a pathogen, and it's the sort generally used for septoria resistance, for example. And we've seen the yellow rust pathogen population change drastically over time in recent years, causing many of these varietal breakdowns. So the yellow rust population is grouped into different colours depending on the genetics of the different races. And these pie charts show how the genetic makeup of the yellow rust population has changed over time. So each slice is a different genetic group, and at the moment we have red, purple, pink, and blue, as shown here. The genetic makeup in 2019 isn't shown here, but from what we can tell so far, it was similar to that in 2018. And United Kingdom Cereal Pathogen Virulence Survey, or UK CPVS, who keep track of the changing pathogen population, are looking into this at the moment. We can see that over the years, the population has become dominated by the red group of isolates. There are many different races of yellow rust in this red group, and each race can infect a different range of varieties. So even though it might look like the population is getting less diverse from these pie charts, actually we don't know what new varieties isolates in this red group might infect. And recently we've seen each year new races from the red group tend to appear, which can usually infect new varieties. So for example, there was an unusual outbreak of yellow rust on KWS Hyatt and Dunstan in some parts of the country in 2019, and a so-called red 27 isolate was identified as the likely cause. And this isolate is currently under investigation by the UK CPVS. We've seen the effect of these new races across the UK, with disease appearing on previously resistant varieties. We know that the recommended list ratings have not kept up with this changing yellow rust population, and more over the years, the ratings aren't reflecting what's being seen in the field from many locations. So for example, this picture on the right is of a trial untreated with fungicide. It has a resistant variety rated with a 9 on the left, and a variety that was rated with a 7 last year on the right. Clearly the variety on the right has much more disease than that on the left and should be getting a much lower rating than a 7 if it's like this in most locations, if it has this much disease. And under the new system, which I'll go on to explain in a moment, the variety on the right now gets a rating of 4, and that's much more realistic. So the reason for this discrepancy isn't to do with poor quality data from our old trials. We take extensive measures to ensure data quality, including annual trial operated disease assessment training, and we have consultant pathologists at NIAB who check all the data over at the end of the season before it's used in the ratings. So we know that the data from the trials are a good reflection of what's seen in the field. But it's the way we've been using the data and the way we calculate the ratings that's the problem, and that's what we've addressed this year. The current way the ratings are calculated is also not able to take account of the rapidly changing pathogen population we're seeing now. Over the years, we've tried several strategies to get around this problem. So, for example, in 2016, when there was a sudden shift in the yellow rust population, we used 1 year of data to calculate the ratings. And last year, we put a warning box around the ratings to say that all varieties needed close monitoring due to the ongoing changes in the rust populations. But neither of these are long-term solutions. We needed to rehaul the system. The risks from this disease is increasing every year. We're having milder winters, we're losing epoxyconazole in 2021, and we have a dynamic yellow rust population. The earlier drilling we've seen this year in some places could also increase pressure in 2021. The first change we've made is to introduce what we call weighted ratings. And this is aimed at enabling the ratings to take account of the rapidly changing pathogen population. The disease ratings tend to be calculated on the last 3 years of data, and using 3 years of data provides stable, robust, and really reliable ratings. But up until now, the average disease across these 3 years has been used to calculate a rating, with each year of data contributing an equal amount to the rating. So, for example, before, in 2018, the data would have had a weighting of 1, 2019, the data would have had a weighting of 1, and 2020, the data would have had a weighting of 1. And where pathogen populations are relatively stable, this method provides robust ratings. But where pathogen populations are dynamic, such as with yellow and brown rust, this method takes no account of the increased disease that might have resulted from races present in the most recent year or years that weren't present in the years before that. So where before the previous 3 years contributed equally to the rating, now the most recent year will contribute 3 times as much as the first year. So we can see, for example, for this year's ratings, 2018 has a weighting of 1, 2019 has a weighting of 2, and 2020 has a weighting of 3. So before it was 1, 1, 1, and now it's 1, 2, 3. And this means that varieties that have had more disease in the most recent year, for example, because the variety is susceptible to a new race of yellow rust, will have lower ratings than they would have done if the previous method was used. And these varieties will have a lower rating than another variety that had the same but stable levels of disease across the 3 years. So let's look at a couple of examples to explain this. Here we have variety A and variety B, and here both their ratings are worked out using the old method, so giving an equal weighting to each year. Variety A had stable levels of yellow rust. They had 8% yellow rust in each of the 3 years, whereas variety B had increasing levels of yellow rust across the 3 years. So it had 6% in 2018, 8% in 2019, and 10% in 2020. For variety A with an equal weighting, the average level of disease is 8%, and this leads to a rating of 4.5, which would be rounded up to a 5 in the RR booklet. But the average level of disease for variety B when using this old method is also 8%, even though it has more disease in the most recent year. And now if we look at what would have happened to these 2 varieties with the new method using the different ratings, variety A would have had the same level of disease, and so the same rating of 4.5 as before, but variety B would have had its higher yellow rust level of 10% in 2020 be given a bigger weighting, and its lower yellow rust level of 6% in 2018 a smaller weighting. So this means it has an overall average level of disease of 8.7%, which leads to a rating of 4.3, which is then rounded down to a 4 in the booklet. So this shows how this new system gives relatively lower ratings to varieties that appear to be succumbing to a new race of yellow rust, such as variety B. But the beauty of the system is that If there are no changes in the yellow rust levels across the years in any of the varieties, then the relative differences between varieties will be the same as if the current method is used. This new method will only provide a different rating to before when the variety is becoming more, or indeed less, susceptible over the years. And overall, this has only caused small changes to the ratings this year. We're using this new weighted system for both brown rust and yellow rust in winter wheat going forward, and we'll be looking to introduce it for spring wheat next year. So the second change we're making is the change responsible for the big changes in the ratings we're seeing this year, and it's to reset the slope that's used to calculate the yellow rust ratings. So first, I'll just take you through how disease ratings are calculated. So the way that all disease ratings are calculated for the recommended list is by plotting the amount of disease a variety gets against the slope, which gives us a rating. The slope is determined using known resistant and known susceptible varieties to fix the top and bottom of the slope. And this chart shows an example of a slope with the green dots, the different varieties which we're calculating ratings for. And you can see here that all the varieties' ratings are calculated along this slope based on the amount of disease they got. The problem has come about when we've tried to reduce fluctuations in ratings between years. Normally, this is the right thing to do, as ratings shouldn't change much between years if there's no reason for this. For example, as might happen if there was a change in the pathogen population. But for diseases such as yellow rust, where there are changes, these changes have been real. And the trouble is, in the last few years, the population has been changing gradually every year, rather than a sudden shift, like we saw in 2016. So it's less easy to establish definitely which varieties have been affected by the change. And this has allowed the rating slope to gradually creep upwards over the last few years. So you can see that this was the slope used in 2012. In 2015, it crept up a bit, and in 2019, it crept up even more. And each time the slope gets less steep, it causes the same amount of yellow rust to lead to a higher rating. So for example, in 2012, 10% yellow rust would have received a rating of 4, but in 2019, 10%, so the same amount, would have received a rating of 5. And this has also meant that varieties that have become more susceptible each year due to the changing races have been given the same rating when they should have been given lower ratings each year. And this has led to the misleading yellow rust ratings we've been seeing in the RL in recent years. So what have we done about this? For this year's ratings, we've reset the slope back down to around the 2012 level. And this means, for example, varieties that got 10% disease will once more get a rating of 4. This not only makes the ratings more representative, it also gives a wider slope, which enables better discrimination between varieties. And this change has a bigger impact on varieties with lower ratings than those with higher ratings. We'll aim to maintain this slope in the future so that each year the same amount of disease gives the same rating across the years. So hopefully we won't need to do it again, and yellow rust ratings will remain representative. This chart shows the impact these changes have had on the varieties' ratings this year. I've only included varieties that were also recommended last year in these charts, as new varieties added to the recommended list this year don't have a rating from last year to compare against. The blue bars represent last year's ratings and the green bars represent this year's ratings, and each bar shows the number of varieties that got that rating in the 2 different years. We can see that overall yellow rust ratings have reduced, but it's encouraging to see how many resistant varieties we still have compared to the more susceptible varieties. In fact, over half of the varieties have a rating of 7 or above. And for those varieties whose ratings have dropped, it doesn't necessarily mean the varieties become more susceptible in 2020, although some of them have. For the most part, large drops are due to the change in the way the ratings have been calculated. And even on varieties now rated with a 3, sufficient yellow rust control can be achieved with a combination of chemical and cultural controls, So please don't discount these varieties. And anyway, it's good to grow a range of varieties that have different disease resistance ratings rather than all yellow rust ratings of 8s and 9s, as this can reduce the likelihood of further varietal breakdown in the future. When we look at the changes in the brown rust ratings, we can see there are many fewer changes. Remember, these were not subject to the reset slope. The only change is to use a weighted rating. So a few more are rated 5 and a few fewer rated 6 to 8. Something to bear in mind when using the recommended list yellow rust ratings is that these ratings reflect the resistance that adult plants have to yellow rust, not the resistance at the young plant stage. And this is because varietal resistance genes against yellow rust operate at different stages of the plant's growth. So adult plant resistance should be operating by growth stage 55, but this means that at the T0 and T1 and sometimes T2 timings, the plant may still have its young plant susceptibility. And if it gets yellow rust, it might need a fungicide to keep a lid on the disease. So if you're growing a resistant variety that has young plant susceptibility and you see disease on it before growth stage 55, it doesn't necessarily mean the variety is broken down to a new race of yellow rust. And we can see here that quite a few varieties classed as resistant on the RL are susceptible at the young plant stage. So this lists varieties that have main RL ratings of 7, 8 and 9. And on the left are the varieties that have young plant susceptibility, and on the right are the varieties that have young plant resistance. So even though the varieties on the left have good recommended list ratings, we would still expect to see yellow rust in them before around the T2 timing. So the final thing I want to talk about is some additional information AHDB will be releasing about how to focus monitoring and management of the dynamic yellow rust population in the 2021 growing season. And although this information is based on recommended list trials, it's not intended for varietal selection. We're calling it the watch list, and it aims to show varieties that performed out of line with the main RL yellow rust rating at some sites in the most recent year. This may be able to indicate a variety's potential susceptibility to uncommon races of yellow rust, which at the moment aren't widespread. However, this watch list won't be able to predict what changes might happen in the coming season. This will be released in the new year, and we'll do an extension of this video to include an explanation of how this watch list is compiled, what it shows, and how it can help with varietal monitoring. So just to wrap up what we've talked about today, there are two changes that have been applied to the main RL yellow rust ratings, the weighted rating and the reset slope. The reset slope won't be applied annually, but the weighted ratings will, and the brown rust ratings will also be subject to the weighting described earlier. We'll be releasing the watch list in the new year, and this is to be used as a monitoring and management tool rather than for variety selection. So finally, I'd like to thank all those who've helped develop and implement these changes to the rust ratings, including our statistician, Adrian Roberts at BIOS, pathologists Jane Thomas at NIAB and James Brown at the John Innes Centre. I'd also like to thank the work of the UK CPVS and their help from their steering committee. And I'd like to thank BSPB and the breeders and the rest of the RL team, RL crop committees and RL project board. So there will be an opportunity to ask questions about this at the RL webinar tomorrow, the 1st of December at 11 AM. So please do come along to that.